Inside the world's largest banana farm, full banana and banana blossom harvest process. A worker climbs 3 rungs up a wooden ladder propped against a banana plant twice his height, reaches into a tangle of broad green leaves, and grips something most people who eat bananas every week have never actually seen. It's not fruit. It's a single, heavy, tear-shaped bud the size of a rugby ball, wrapped in layer after layer of dark reddish-purple petals, hanging on its own thick stem below a cluster of green bananas that are still weeks from ready. He cuts it free in one motion, and it drops, heavier than it looks, into a woven basket already half full of identical purple shapes. For most of the history of commercial banana farming, that object gets thrown away. It's not the crop. It's not what anyone is paying for. It is, technically, a byproduct, something growers cut off a plant and discard by the truckload every single day on every banana farm on Earth. Because leaving it attached slows down the thing that actually makes money, the bunch of bananas above it. And yet here is a team of workers on one of the largest banana operations on the planet, treating it like something worth collecting. This video is about that farm, and about the fruit growing on it, which travels farther, in higher volume, than almost any other fresh food on the planet. One country ships more bananas out of its ports than any other nation on Earth, feeding grocery stores on nearly every continent, from operations like this one. Rows of banana plants stretching to a horizon you can't see the end of. Each one grown from a single underground stem, each one producing exactly one bunch of fruit in its entire working life. All timed, tended, and harvested by hand, at a scale that's difficult to picture until you're standing in the middle of it. We're going to walk through the entire process, from a sucker planted in the ground to a green bunch loaded onto a refrigerated ship bound for a port thousands of kilometers away. And we're going to figure out exactly why that purple bud in the basket, the thing that's been treated as garbage for most of the history of this industry, is quietly becoming something else. Not garbage. Not quite a crop either. Something in between. And the story of how it got there says a lot about what happens when an industry finally stops wasting the parts of a plant it didn't think it needed. Stand at the edge of a farm like this one, and the scale is almost disorienting. Rows of identical plants run in perfectly straight lines toward a horizon that, depending on where you're standing, might genuinely be out of sight. Every stalk in every row is doing the exact same thing on roughly the exact same schedule. Building height, pushing out leaves, eventually flowering. Because every one of them was planted from a cutting off another plant just like it. It doesn't look like a wild landscape at all. It looks closer to a factory floor that happens to be made of living plants, stretching out under open sky instead of a roof, with workers moving through it on foot doing jobs that, more than a century into industrial banana farming, still can't be handed off to a machine. Start with the basic shape of the world banana trade, because it isn't what you'd expect. The single largest producer of bananas on Earth, by a wide margin, is India, somewhere around 38 million metric tons a year, more than any other country grows. If you only looked at total production, India would be the obvious subject for a video like this. But almost none of that fruit ever leaves the country. It's grown, sold, and eaten domestically, inside India's own borders, at a scale so large it barely needs to touch the export market at all. The country that actually dominates the banana trade, the one whose bananas you are statistically most likely to have eaten if you live almost anywhere outside South Asia, is Ecuador. In a single recent year, Ecuador shipped out a record 378 million boxes of bananas. Do the conversion, and that's somewhere in the range of 6.5 to nearly 7 million tons of fresh fruit, loaded onto ships and sent to more than 60 countries around the world. That one country accounts for roughly 28% of every banana that crosses a border anywhere on the planet. More than the Philippines, more than Colombia, more than Costa Rica, more than any other exporting nation, and it isn't close. In export value, that's close to $4 billion a year, from fruit that sells for pocket change per pound in the store where you eventually buy it. 2 markets alone, the European Union and Russia, absorb over half of everything Ecuador ships, which means a huge share of the produce aisle in supermarkets across an entire continent, plus one of the largest countries on Earth, is running on fruit grown on plantations like the one we're about to walk through. Zoom into that country, And you find operations built at a scale that's hard to describe without just listing numbers. One of the country's major producers, a company whose plantations we'll be following through this video, farms somewhere around 10,000 hectares of banana plants. About 7,000 of those hectares are worked directly by the company's own crews. The remaining 3,000 are farmed by independent local growers who are contracted into the same export pipeline, selling their fruit into the same packing houses, the same boxes, the same ships. In a single recent year, that one operation alone exported nearly 28 million boxes of bananas to markets across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. 10,000 hectares is roughly the size of a mid-sized city, except instead of streets and buildings, it's rows of identical plants, each one roughly the height of a two-story house, planted close enough together that from above, the whole thing reads as a single, unbroken carpet of green. Some accounts of Ecuador's largest single banana operations put the true scale even higher. Descriptions of a plantation spanning as much as 30,000 hectares circulate online, though that specific figure isn't independently confirmed the way the 10,000 hectare numbers are. Even taking the more conservative, better documented figure, you're still talking about a single farming operation large enough that walking its full perimeter in a day would be a serious undertaking. Whichever exact figure you use, the practical experience of standing inside one of these operations is the same. There is no vantage point on the ground from which you can see the whole thing at once. Drive down one of the internal access roads that cut through the property, and identical rows keep unspooling past the windows for minutes at a time. Plant after plant, all at roughly the same stage of growth, if that section was planted together, all fed by the same irrigation network, all destined, eventually, for the same packing house. It's less like touring a farm, and more like touring an entire agricultural district that happens to answer to a single company. To put that 10,000 hectare figure in a frame most people can actually picture, that's roughly the footprint of a small city, except instead of neighborhoods and roads, it's an unbroken grid of plants, spaced just far enough apart for a worker to walk between them, repeated enough times to cover an area you could not walk across in a single day. Somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 of those hectares, on the operation we're following, are worked directly by the company's own crews, year-round. The rest belongs to independent local growers under contract, feeding fruit into the exact same packing houses and the exact same export boxes as the company-run land. So that from the outside, from a supermarket shelf on another continent, there's no way to tell which banana came from which side of that arrangement. It's one supply chain, built out of thousands of individual growing decisions made every single day across an area too large for any one person to personally oversee. And every single plant on that land is doing something unusual, biologically speaking, that most people don't realize when they're peeling a banana at breakfast. It is not a tree. It just looks like one. What appears to be a woody trunk is actually a tightly wound column of overlapping leaf sheaths. Technically, the largest herbaceous flowering plant on Earth. Not a single piece of wood in it. Underground, the real plant is a swollen stem called a corm, and it's the corm, not the visible trunk, that's doing the long-term work. After one cycle of growth, the corm sends up a new shoot, a sucker, which becomes the next plant, which produces the next bunch. The stalk you see standing in the field will fruit exactly once, get cut down, and be replaced by its own offspring growing from the same root system. A farm that, in a sense, never stops regenerating itself from underground. Compare that regenerating, one-shot growth model to almost any other major export fruit, and it starts to look genuinely unusual. An apple tree or a citrus tree, once established, keeps producing fruit year after year off the same woody structure for decades. A banana stalk gives you exactly one bunch, ever, and then has to be replaced by its own offspring before the cycle can continue. Every bunch of bananas that ever reaches a store shelf anywhere in the world represents an entire individual plant's complete lifetime output, not a single season's harvest off a tree that will simply flower again next year. That's the plant. Bananas are the fourth most important food crop in the developing world, ranked by how many people depend on it, behind only rice, wheat, and corn. Total global production runs around 120 million tons a year, and the fruit itself, the specific variety responsible for almost all of that trade, is a single cultivar called Cavendish, accounting for something like 47% of everything grown worldwide, and close to all of what actually gets exported. Nearly every banana in every grocery store on every continent you can name is genetically close to identical to the one next to it, which sounds efficient. It's also, as we're about to see, exactly the kind of setup that terrifies the people who actually run these farms, because uniform crops fail in a uniform way, all at once, everywhere. There's also a stakes-raising detail hiding inside the export numbers themselves. Two markets, the European Union and Russia, take in more than half of everything Ecuador ships, which means demand from those regions alone is effectively setting the pace for an enormous share of an entire national industry. A shift in buying patterns in either market, a new trade restriction, a currency shock, a shipping disruption on either route, any of it ripples straight back down the chain to decisions being made on the ground, on farms like this one, about how many bunches to cut this week and how many boxes to fill. The scale of the operation doesn't insulate it from that kind of pressure. If anything, it means more people, more land, and more livelihoods are riding on the same narrow set of buying relationships holding steady. Here's the first problem with farming bananas at the scale we just described. Almost none of it can be automated, and the plant itself is working against you the entire time. Start with timing. A banana plant grown from a freshly planted sucker takes somewhere between 9 and 18 months before it produces a harvestable bunch, depending on the variety and the climate. For the Cavendish variety specifically, it's usually 12 to 14 months from planting to first harvest. That's over a year of watering, weeding, propping, and protecting a single plant for exactly one payoff, one bunch of fruit, once, ever. There's no second season on the same stalk. The growth itself breaks into 3 long phases, about 6 months of pure vegetative growth, building up the pseudostem and leaves, roughly 3 months more before the flower structure fully emerges, and another 3 months after that before the fruit is ready. Even once the flower has opened and the tiny fruit fingers have started to form, it still takes 75 to 80 days under good tropical conditions before that fruit is anywhere near ready to cut. You cannot rush any part of this. You can only manage it. Then there's the plant's own structure working against the farmer. Because it's an herb, not a tree, a banana plant has no real wood to brace itself with. The trunk is soft, made of layered leaf tissue, which means a fully loaded plant, carrying a bunch of bananas that can weigh anywhere from 25 to 50 plus kilograms, hanging off the top of a stalk that can be 5 or 6 meters tall, is structurally vulnerable. Wind, heavy rain, even the sheer weight of its own fruit can snap a stalk before harvest, and there is no way to unhappen that. Months of growth, gone in a single storm. There's a related, more everyday version of the same fragility running underneath the growing cycle. Because so much of a plantation is planted from cuttings taken off existing plants, disease or pest pressure that affects one part of the field is working with a population that has essentially no genetic variation to fall back on. A pathogen or pest that struggles against one plant's specific biology struggles against all of them equally, and one that succeeds against one plant succeeds against all of them equally too. Growers manage this with strict sanitation protocols, cleaning tools between plants, controlling which cuttings get planted where, and monitoring fields closely for early signs of trouble. But the underlying vulnerability, a field full of genetic near twins, never fully goes away. Next, there's the threat that keeps entire national banana industries awake at night, a soil-borne fungal disease called fusarium wilt, more commonly known by its old name, Panama disease. The strain currently spreading through banana-growing regions worldwide, called tropical race 4, is genuinely one of the most dangerous plant diseases in modern agriculture. Not because it's fast, but because it's permanent. Once it establishes itself in a field's soil, there is no cure. No fungicide clears it. No amount of good farming reverses it. The fungus can persist in the ground for decades, and land that's been infected can become effectively unusable for banana cultivation for the rest of anyone's working lifetime. For an industry built entirely around one genetically near-identical variety, planted across enormous continuous areas, A soil disease with no cure isn't a farming problem. It's an existential one. There's also a quieter, constant wall running underneath all of this. Quality control, at a scale where even a small error rate becomes a large absolute number. If even a modest percentage of bunches across a 10,000-hectare operation come out slightly wrong, cut a day too early, bruised in handling, marked by wind damage the bagging didn't fully prevent, that small percentage still represents thousands of individual bunches, each one representing over a year of growth that will never make it into an export box at full value. There's no way to inspect every single banana on every single plant before the harvest decision is made. The system has to accept that some fraction of the crop will always fall short, and build enough margin into the overall volume to absorb that loss without it threatening the business. And then, even assuming the plant survives its full growth cycle undamaged and disease-free, there's the timing wall that has nothing to do with growing the fruit at all. Bananas can only be harvested green. Every single banana that leaves one of these farms is cut while it is still hard, starchy, and unripe. Because a ripe banana cannot survive the trip. It bruises under its own weight, softens within days, and would arrive at its destination a spoiled brown mess weeks before it got there. Which means the entire industry is built around a genuinely strange constraint. Harvest a fruit before it's actually ripe, ship it across an ocean in a condition that would look, to anyone who didn't understand the process, like a mistake, and trust that the ripening can be started up again, on command, on the other end. Get that timing wrong in either direction, cut too early or too late, and you either ship fruit that will never ripen properly, or fruit that ripens and rots before it clears customs. Add to all of that the sheer unpredictability of the growing conditions themselves. Rainfall varies year to year. Temperature swings affect how quickly a bunch fills out. Soil quality isn't perfectly uniform across 10,000 hectares, no matter how carefully a company manages it, which means two plants started on the exact same day, from genetically identical cuttings, can still end up on slightly different timelines by the time they're ready to flower. Multiply that variability across every single plant on the farm, and you get a harvest that never actually arrives all at once. It arrives in a rolling wave, different sections of the farm reaching maturity on different days, which means the entire operation has to run harvest crews continuously, every working day of the year, rather than concentrating labor around one seasonal peak the way many other crops do. None of these problems have a purely mechanical solution. You can't build a machine that senses exactly when a banana bunch has reached the correct shade of green at the correct starch level on a plant whose exact growth rate varies with rainfall, temperature, and soil. Every single one of these judgment calls, across 10,000 hectares of identical-looking plants, still gets made by a person, walking the rows, by hand, which means the entire economics of an operation this size ultimately rest on the accumulated experience of a workforce large enough to cover that much ground, day after day, without ever getting to take a season off. The way growers solved most of this wasn't one dramatic invention. It was a set of very specific, learned interventions, each one addressing a different piece of the wall, and one of those interventions turned out to have an unexpected second life. The first fix targets the plant's own biology directly. Once the female flowers on a bunch have set fruit, meaning the actual bananas have started forming, the plant is still carrying that large purple structure below them, the male flower, the same purple bud from the opening of this video. Left in place, it keeps drawing energy from the plant, energy that could otherwise be going into finishing the fruit above it, and it creates a soft, exposed target for insects and disease. So growers cut it. The technique is sometimes called deflowering, sometimes definging, and it's been standard practice for a long time. A worker with pruning shears or a small saw cuts through the stem connecting that purple bud to the fruit bunch, and the blossom comes away in one piece. For most of the history of this industry, that's where the story of the blossom ends. Cut, dropped, left to rot on the ground or hauled off with other plant waste. It was never the product. It was an obstacle in the way of the product. And on plenty of banana operations around the world today, that's still exactly where the story ends. Nothing about deflowering itself requires anyone to collect what's cut. The technique exists purely to benefit the fruit, And the blossom's fate after that point has always been a completely separate decision, made or not made independently by whoever's running a given farm. But here's the turning point. That blossom isn't actually waste. Peel back the tough purple outer bracts, and underneath is a pale, tender core, sometimes called the banana heart, along with individual florets, each one still holding a small edible structure that has to be removed by hand before cooking. It's genuinely labor-intensive to prepare. Every single floret needs its thin, matchstick-shaped internal pistil plucked out one at a time, a tedious hand job that has kept the blossom out of industrial food processing for a long time. But across large parts of South and Southeast Asia, Filipino, Vietnamese, Thai, and Indian kitchens among many others, that same blossom has always been a genuine, valued ingredient. Sliced and used as a vegetable, or prepared specifically as a plant-based substitute for meat in dishes that call for exactly the fibrous, absorbent texture the banana heart provides. That crossover, a structure that industrial fruit farming treats as a discard and an entire culinary tradition treats as a delicacy, is exactly the kind of gap that eventually gets closed. There is now a real, measurable global market for packaged and processed banana blossom, worth tens of millions of dollars and growing at somewhere around 7 to 9% a year, driven in large part by demand for plant-based, meat-alternative ingredients. Some of the largest volumes moving through that market currently come out of China, shipped onward to buyers in Vietnam, India, and the United States. It is still a small market compared to the fruit trade sitting above it. Nobody is claiming the banana blossom is about to rival the banana itself, but it represents something the industry didn't used to bother with, treating a byproduct of standard cultivation as a second harvest instead of trash. It's worth sitting with how strange that shift actually is, from the perspective of a plant. Every single blossom sold into that market is a structure the fruit farming side of the industry has been actively removing and throwing away, on purpose, for generations, purely to make the primary crop grow better. Nobody bred a special blossom-producing banana variety. Nobody added a step to the growing process to create more of it. The entire supply of raw material for a tens of millions of dollars global market already existed, in full, on every banana farm on Earth, every single day. It just took someone deciding that a byproduct was worth the extra labor of turning into a product. That second half of the sentence is doing a lot of work, because the labor really is extra. Fruit side deflowering only requires a clean cut and a basket. Turning that same cut blossom into something edible means an entirely separate, much slower workflow. Peeling, trimming, and the floret by floret pistil removal that no machine currently does faster or cheaper than a patient set of human hands. On operations where that second workflow exists at all, it typically runs as its own small team, working through baskets of freshly cut blossoms at a pace measured in individual florets rather than tons per hour. A sharp contrast to almost everything else happening on the fruit side of the same farm. The second turning point solved a completely different piece of the wall. The timing problem, the one about shipping unripe fruit across an ocean. The fix here is a technique called bagging. Once the fruit bunch has set and is developing, workers slide a large, perforated blue polyethylene bag down over the entire bunch, leaving it wrapped for the rest of its growth. That single, unglamorous piece of plastic does 3 separate jobs at once. It physically protects the developing fruit from insects and from wind scarring that would otherwise mark or damage the peel. It shields the bunch from cold snaps that can stunt growth, and it slightly raises the temperature immediately around the fruit, which helps the whole bunch ripen, or in this case, mature toward harvest, more evenly, so an entire bunch reaches the correct green harvest window at close to the same time, rather than some fingers being ready while others lag behind. About 12 weeks after a bag goes on, the fruit inside is ready to cut. The bag itself is a small piece of engineering that took real trial and error to land on. The perforations have to be sized precisely enough to let air circulate and prevent the humid, enclosed environment from encouraging rot, while still being small enough to keep out the insects and wind-blown debris the bag exists to block in the first place. The blue color isn't decorative either. The shade is chosen specifically because it affects light penetration into the bag in a way growers have found improves how evenly the fruit inside develops, compared to clear or untinted covering. It is, in other words, A genuinely optimized piece of plastic, refined over years of use across an industry that ships enough of it to visibly change the color of a plantation from the air. Between deflowering, bagging, and a packing house process built around precisely controlled cold chain shipping, which we'll walk through in detail in a few minutes. An industry that starts with an unautomatable, biologically stubborn plant somehow turns into one of the most reliable, highest-volume fresh food export chains on Earth. None of the individual fixes are especially high-tech. What makes the system work is doing every single one of them correctly, at the same time, across 10,000 hectares, every single day of the year, without a growing season to reset the clock. Not everyone is convinced this system is as stable as its export numbers suggest. And the skepticism isn't coming from outside critics. It's coming from people inside the industry who've watched this exact scenario play out before. Start with the elephant already mentioned, Cavendish. Nearly every banana that gets exported anywhere in the world is genetically close to identical to every other one. That uniformity is what makes the whole system work. Predictable growth timing, predictable size, predictable shipping behavior. It's also, to anyone who knows the history of this industry, a warning sign. Cavendish isn't actually the first, only variety that matters the export trade has ever built itself around. Through the first half of the 20th century, the dominant export banana wasn't Cavendish at all. It was a different variety. And that earlier industry was wiped out by an earlier strain of the same disease we've already discussed, Panama disease, which spread through plantations so thoroughly that growers eventually had no choice but to abandon that variety entirely and rebuild the global trade around Cavendish instead, specifically because Cavendish resisted the older strain. That switch happened once already, at massive cost, disruption, and expense. Now the current strain, Tropical Race 4, attacks Cavendish too, and there is, at the time of this filming, no equivalent replacement variety waiting in the wings that combines Cavendish's shipping durability with resistance to the new strain. Skeptics inside the industry are blunt about it. An industry that has already had to completely replace its global export variety once, for exactly this reason, does not have a guaranteed second escape route. What makes that history unsettling rather than just cautionary is the timeline involved. The first switch, away from the earlier dominant variety, wasn't a decision made in advance out of caution. It was forced, plantation by plantation, region by region, over years, as growers watched fields they'd invested in become permanently unusable and scrambled to replace them with something the disease couldn't reach yet. There was no controlled transition. There was crisis management at agricultural scale, repeated across an entire industry, until Cavendish was simply what was left standing. Nothing about the structure of the current export trade guarantees that a second transition, if it ever becomes necessary, would go any more smoothly than the first one did. Then, there's a narrower, more immediate skepticism aimed specifically at the banana blossom side of the story. Is harvesting it actually worth doing at industrial scale? The labor math is genuinely unfavorable. Every floret inside every blossom needs its pistil hand-plucked before it's usable in cooking. There's no mechanized shortcut for that step, no machine that can do it faster than a person with steady hands and patience. On a farm, harvesting tens of thousands of bunches, adding a second, entirely manual processing chain for a byproduct that used to just get thrown on a compost pile is, to some growers, simply not worth the added labor cost, relative to what the blossom actually sells for. The market is real, but it's still small relative to the fruit trade sitting above it, and turning "we used to throw this away" into "this is now a meaningful second revenue line" requires exactly the kind of patient, low-margin labor that large export operations don't always have spare capacity for. And there's a third, quieter doubt that runs through the whole system. Is a supply chain this dependent on precise timing, precise harvest windows, precise cold chain temperatures, precise shipping schedules across oceans, actually as resilient as its volume numbers suggest? Or is it simply an industry that hasn't yet been tested by the kind of disruption that would expose how little slack is built into it? A single delayed shipment, a single temperature failure in a refrigerated hold, can turn a container of correctly harvested green fruit into a total loss by the time it reaches port. The system works, at enormous scale, day after day. But it has worked so far, and "it can't fail" are two very different claims, and the people running these operations know the difference. So how does the industry actually answer these doubts? Not by claiming the risks aren't real. They are, and everyone in the trade knows it. But by pointing at what's already been built to manage them. Disease monitoring protocols on the ground, cold chain infrastructure engineered specifically around the fruit's biology rather than around generic shipping standards, and, on the blossom side, a market that is still small but has been growing consistently for years rather than appearing and disappearing as a passing trend. None of that eliminates the underlying vulnerability of a monoculture crop. What it does is buy the industry time, and time, on a plant that takes over a year to grow a single bunch, is the one resource nobody in this business has ever had enough of. None of these arguments fully resolve the underlying tension, and that's worth being honest about rather than smoothing over. An industry built on a single genetic line of one crop, farmed across enormous continuous areas, shipped on a schedule with almost no room for delay, is exactly the kind of system that looks unbreakable right up until the moment it isn't. The people running operations at this scale aren't naive about that. They're making a calculated bet that the disease monitoring, the biosecurity protocols, and the sheer scale of investment already sunk into Cavendish-based infrastructure will hold long enough for either a resistant variety or some other solution to catch up. A bet made not because the risk is small, but because there currently isn't a better alternative on the table. So here's the entire cycle, start to finish. From a piece of underground stem to a box loaded onto a ship, with the banana blossom's own parallel path folded in exactly where it happens on the real timeline. Step 1. Planting. A new banana plant almost never starts from a seed. Commercial Cavendish is essentially seedless, which is part of why it's so consistent from bunch to bunch. Instead, workers plant a sucker, a shoot cut from the base of an existing, already producing plant, directly into prepared soil. Because that sucker is genetically identical to its parent, an entire 10,000-hectare farm can be, essentially, one enormous set of clones descended from a much smaller number of original source plants. Rows are laid out with deliberate spacing between plants, close enough to make efficient use of the land, wide enough that a full-grown stalk, with its wide leaves fully unfurled, doesn't crowd out its neighbors or block the airflow the whole field depends on to stay disease-resistant. Step 2. Vegetative growth. For roughly the next 6 months, the plant does nothing but build itself, pushing up its pseudostem, unfurling broad leaves one after another, drawing entirely on the corm's stored energy and whatever nutrients and water field crews are managing through irrigation and fertilization. There's no fruit yet, no flower yet. This stage is pure infrastructure building, and it's also when the plant is most vulnerable to wind damage, since the stalk hasn't reached its full structural height and thickness. Field crews spend this period on maintenance work that never really stops on a farm this size, clearing weeds that would otherwise compete for water and nutrients, checking irrigation lines across the property, and removing damaged or diseased leaves before a problem on one plant has a chance to spread to its neighbors down the row. Step 3. Flowering. Around month 8, the first sign of the reproductive stage appears. A flower structure begins to emerge from the center of the stalk, eventually pushing outward and downward under its own weight. This is the point where the plant's growth stops being purely vegetative and starts visibly separating into two distinct parts. The female flowers closest to the stalk, which will become the individual bananas, and, below them, the same large purple structure we opened the video with, the male flower, the future banana blossom. From this point forward, the plant is putting a large share of its remaining stored energy into this single reproductive structure, which is exactly why what happens next, which part gets kept and which part gets cut, matters so much to how the rest of the cycle plays out. Step 4. Fruit set and the fork in the road. As the female flowers finish opening, the tiny fruit fingers begin to form in tight rows, curved and green, still far too small to be useful. This is the exact moment field crews make the decision that splits the story into its two paths. On the fruit side, the bunch above is left to keep developing. On the blossom side, crews move in to cut the purple bud free from the base of the bunch. the deflowering step, because leaving it attached from this point forward serves no purpose to the fruit crop and only draws resources away from it. Step 5. The blossoms path. Cut blossoms go into collection baskets, exactly like the one from the opening scene, and from there to a separate processing area, smaller, slower, and far more manual than anything happening on the fruit side. Workers peel back the tough outer purple bracts by hand, layer by layer, until they reach the pale, tender inner core and the cluster of individual florets underneath. Each floret then goes through the tedious cleaning step, plucking out its thin, matchstick-shaped pistil, one at a time, before the blossom is usable as food. This entire secondary process runs on its own schedule, separate from the fruit-focused machinery of the rest of the farm, feeding into the smaller but genuinely growing banana blossom market, rather than the main fruit export chain. Step 6. Bagging, back on the fruit side. With the blossom removed, the bunch of developing bananas gets its blue, perforated bag, slid down over the whole cluster and left in place for the rest of the growth cycle. From this point until harvest, every bunch on the farm is instantly identifiable at a distance by that bright blue wrapping, which is part of why an aerial view of a working banana plantation looks the way it does. A solid green canopy dotted with thousands of blue plastic shapes. Step 7. Maturation inside the bag. For roughly the next 12 weeks, the fruit finishes developing inside its protective covering, fingers thickening, the bunch filling out to its full size, still entirely green the whole time. Field crews continue walking the rows during this stage, checking bag integrity, watching for wind damage, and tracking which bunches are approaching their harvest window based on how long ago they were bagged, since that timestamp is effectively the countdown clock for the entire bunch. Some operations tie a colored ribbon or tag to the stem at bagging time, marking the week a given bunch went under cover, so that a harvest crew walking the rows months later can tell at a glance, without measuring anything, roughly how close that specific bunch is to its cutting window. Step 8. The harvest decision. A bunch is ready to cut when its individual fingers have visibly plumped out, filled in from a thin, angular cross-section to a rounder, fuller one, and the peel color has shifted from a dark, almost black green to a lighter, more uniform green. There's no ripening happening yet. This is purely a maturity signal, read by an experienced worker's eye, because no automated sensor on these farms is making this call. Get it right, and the fruit will ripen properly and evenly after it's cut. Get it wrong in either direction, and the fruit is compromised before it even leaves the field. Step 9. Cutting. Harvesting a banana bunch is a two-person job, and it has to be because of the weight involved. A full bunch, still on its bag, can weigh anywhere from 25 to more than 50 kilograms. One worker positions padded shoulder gear underneath the bunch and braces to take its full weight. The second worker cuts through the thick stem connecting the bunch to the stalk with a sharp blade. The moment the cut is made, the entire weight of the bunch transfers onto the first worker's shoulders in an instant. There's no gradual handoff, no way to ease into it. It has to be caught, not dropped, because a dropped bunch bruises immediately and loses value on the spot. Once the bunch is safely off the plant, the same crew typically cuts the emptied stalk down entirely, clearing the way for the sucker already growing at its base to take over as the next generation of that same planting position. The harvest of one plant and the start of the next happening in the same few minutes, on the same patch of ground. Step 10. Transport to the packing house. On large operations, cut bunches are carried, still hanging from their harvest hooks, to an overhead cableway system, a network of steel cable running above the rows, that lets workers move enormous volumes of fruit toward the packing facility without wrestling every single bunch onto a vehicle individually. Smaller operations and independent contracted growers may instead move bunches by cart. Either way, the goal is the same. Get freshly cut, still green fruit to processing as fast as possible, minimizing the time between cutting and the first cooling and washing steps. Every extra hour a bunch spends sitting in the heat between the field and the packing house is an hour it can't get back later in the process. A small logistical detail that, multiplied across thousands of bunches a day, is a large part of why a cableway system, unglamorous as it looks, is worth building in the first place. Step 11. breaking down the bunch. At the packing house, the large bunch is broken apart into smaller units. First into hands, the natural curved clusters of individual bananas that grew together on the stalk, and then, depending on the operation and the destination market, sometimes further into smaller clusters of just a few fingers each. Step 11 and a half, in effect, pace matching. It's worth pausing on just how continuously this entire chain has to run. A 10,000-hectare operation isn't cutting fruit once a week. Bunches across the property are reaching their harvest window on a rolling basis, every single working day, which means the packing house behind steps 11 through 17 has to be staffed and operating at a matched, continuous pace, not in scheduled batches. Slow down the packing house for even a day, and cut fruit starts backing up with nowhere to go, at exactly the moment it's most time-sensitive. Step 12. Washing and selection. The first stop inside the packing house is a large tank, commonly around 500 liters of water mixed with several kilograms of alum, where fruit gets its initial cleaning while workers simultaneously sort through it by hand, pulling out anything visibly damaged, bruised, or malformed before it goes any further down the line. This is quality control at its earliest and most decisive point. Fruit rejected here never makes it into an export box at all. Step 13. The fungicide treatment. From the wash tank, selected fruit moves into a second treatment bath, a fungicide solution. Historically, something in the range of several hundred grams of a compound like Bavastin mixed into another large tank of water, where clusters typically soak for around 10 minutes. Because the fruit is going to spend weeks in transit before it even reaches a ripening facility, let alone a store shelf, this step is essential insurance against post-harvest rot developing somewhere in the middle of an ocean crossing, when there's no way to intervene. It's a small, unglamorous 10 minutes in a tank of liquid, easy to overlook next to the scale of everything else happening on the farm. But skip it, and fruit that looked perfect leaving the packing house can arrive at its destination weeks later already breaking down, with no one able to do anything about it until the container is opened on the other side of the ocean. Step 14. Grading. Treated fruit is then sorted by trained graders according to size, shape, curvature, ripeness stage, and any remaining surface imperfections. Different markets and different retailers have different specifications, so this stage effectively sorts the same day's harvest into multiple separate destinations before it's even boxed. A cluster with a slightly tighter curve, a slightly different length, or a barely visible blemish that would be perfectly fine for one buyer might be rejected outright for another, which means the same physical harvest, cut from the same rows on the same morning, can end up split across several different final markets purely based on how it looks once it reaches this stage of the line. Step 15. Weighing and boxing. Graded clusters are weighed out and packed into standardized export cartons, commonly built to a target weight around 18.5 kilograms for shipments bound for European markets, or closer to 13.5 kilograms for Middle Eastern markets, reflecting different retail box standards in different regions. Getting the weight consistent, box after box, matters enormously at this scale, because a single plantation might be filling tens of thousands of these boxes in a single day. Step 16. Wax coating. Many operations apply a thin wax coating to the fruit clusters before final packing, a treatment that slows moisture loss through the peel, helps maintain visual freshness, and reduces spoilage over the course of a long shipping journey, without affecting how the fruit ripens once it eventually reaches its destination. It's an easy step to miss entirely if you're not looking for it. A nearly invisible layer applied to fruit that's already been washed, treated, and graded. But over a multi-week ocean voyage, that thin coating is doing real, measurable work, keeping the peel from drying out and the fruit from losing quality before it ever reaches a ripening room. Step 17. Final packing. Finished clusters go into vacuum-sealed bags, and those bags are packed into padded, corrugated cardboard cartons. The actual export boxes that get stacked, palletized, and loaded for shipping. Every one of those cartons, at this stage, still contains completely green, unripe fruit. That will not change until much closer to the point of sale. Multiply a single filled carton by the tens of thousands that a large packing house can move through in a single day. And this last, quiet step of the process, sealing a box, stacking it on a pallet, is the point where months of growing, weeks of careful timing, and an entire packing house's worth of washing, treating, and grading finally becomes something that can simply be counted, loaded, and shipped. Step 18. Shipping. Packed cartons are loaded onto refrigerated cargo vessels, reefer ships, built specifically to hold cargo at tightly controlled temperature and atmosphere for the entire ocean crossing, which can run several weeks depending on the destination. The controlled cold and controlled atmosphere are what keep the fruit suspended in its green, unripe state throughout the voyage. Without that precise environmental control, the fruit would begin ripening en route and arrive spoiled long before reaching a customer. A single reefer vessel can carry the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of boxes at once, meaning one ship's cargo hold, on its own, can represent weeks of a plantation's total cutting output condensed into a single, controlled atmosphere journey across an ocean. Only once the fruit nears its final market does anyone deliberately trigger ripening, typically at dedicated ripening facilities near the destination, using controlled exposure to ethylene gas, the same natural compound the fruit would eventually produce on its own, just applied on a schedule the supply chain controls rather than the plant. Only at that final stage, days before the fruit reaches a store shelf, does it finally begin turning from the hard green state it left the farm in toward the yellow, ready-to-eat banana most people would actually recognize. That's the full arc. A sucker in the ground, over a year of growth, a fork in the road at the flower, where one path goes to a purple bud and hand-cleaned florets, and another goes to a blue plastic bag and a 12-week countdown. A two-person harvest crew catching 50 kilograms of green fruit on their shoulders. A packing house built around washing, treating, grading, and boxing at a pace matched to the volume of an entire plantation. And finally, weeks at sea inside a controlled atmosphere hold, before a fruit that left the farm hard and green ever gets the chance to ripen at all. Run the process across an entire year, at the scale of an operation like the one we've been following, and the numbers land somewhere genuinely difficult to picture from ground level. One major Ecuadorian producer alone, the roughly 10,000-hectare operation referenced earlier in this video, exported nearly 28 million boxes of bananas in a single recent year, sent out to markets across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Multiply that by every other operation, large and small, contributing to the country's total, and you get Ecuador's full national export figure. Over 378 million boxes in a single year. Somewhere between 6.5 and nearly 7 million tons of fresh fruit, shipped to more than 60 countries, worth close to $4 billion. From one country. Grown on plants that take over a year to fruit once, harvested entirely by hand, 2 workers at a time, 1 bunch at a time. And running quietly alongside all of that, the blossoms. Cut off almost every single one of those bunches somewhere around month 8 or 9 of the growth cycle. Collected in baskets, hand-peeled and hand-cleaned by workers plucking pistils out of individual florets one at a time. Feeding into a global banana blossom market now worth tens of millions of dollars, and still growing by something like 7 to 9% a year. It is, by any honest comparison, a small fraction of the fruit trade sitting above it. Nobody on these farms is under any illusion that the blossom business will ever rival the banana business. But it represents a real shift in how the industry treats what used to be pure waste. A byproduct that, for most of this trade's history, simply went in the trash, is now, on at least some of these operations, a second product line. Smaller, slower, more labor-intensive, but genuinely sold, genuinely eaten, genuinely valued by an entirely different set of customers than the ones buying the fruit. Put those two numbers side by side, and the shape of the whole story becomes clear. A plant that isn't even a tree, farmed at a scale that reshapes the landscape of an entire country, feeding a genuine global fruit trade worth billions of dollars a year, and, growing in the margins of that same industry, a second, much smaller trade built entirely on the part of the plant that used to just get thrown away. None of it happens without the workforce walking those rows every single day. The 2-person harvest teams catching 50-kilogram bunches on their shoulders, the packing house crews washing, grading, and boxing fruit fast enough to match the pace of an entire plantation's daily cut, and the smaller teams peeling blossoms and plucking florets by hand for a market most banana buyers have never even heard exists.
Strip away the export tonnage and the billion-dollar totals, and what's actually underneath all of it is an enormous number of individual, repeated human judgment calls, made correctly at a scale large enough to feed a meaningful share of the produce aisles on an entire continent. It's also worth pausing on what doesn't show up in any of those export totals. The local growers folded into the same supply chain as the large company-run land, each contributing their own smaller acreage into the same packing houses and the same boxes. A national export figure in the hundreds of millions of boxes isn't just the output of a handful of giant operations. It's the combined output of company-run plantations and a much larger, harder-to-count network of smaller contracted farms, all timed to the same harvest windows, all meeting the same grading standards, all feeding the same ships.
The scale of the industry is really the scale of thousands of individual growing decisions, made correctly, in sync, often without any of those individual growers ever meeting each other. There's a specific kind of story that keeps showing up once you start looking closely at large-scale food production, and this is one of the cleanest versions of it. An industry spends decades optimizing relentlessly around exactly one output, in this case, the fruit, and in doing so, treats everything else the plant produces as an obstacle to clear out of the way as efficiently as possible. The purple blossom wasn't hidden. It wasn't rare. It was sitting in plain sight on every single banana plant on every farm on Earth, cut off and discarded by the truckload, every day, for longer than most people alive today have been eating bananas. Nobody needed to discover it. They just needed a reason to stop throwing it away. What makes it a genuinely useful story, rather than just a curious footnote, is how ordinary the whole setup turns out to be once you actually walk through it. There's no secret ingredient here. No proprietary technology, no single breakthrough moment that changed everything overnight. It's a plant doing what plants do, growing a flower, setting fruit, producing a structure the grower doesn't need, and an industry slowly, unevenly, market by market, realizing that we don't need this and this has no value, were never actually the same claim. Somewhere on the other side of the planet from these fields, in kitchens that had never stopped valuing the banana heart in the first place, that gap was obvious the whole time. It just took the export side of the industry a long time to notice there was a customer on the other end of what it had been treating as trash. That's really what this whole video comes down to. A country that ships more bananas than any other nation on Earth built that position on an unglamorous foundation. A plant that isn't a tree, that only fruits once, that has to be tended, timed, and harvested almost entirely by hand, across land measured in the tens of thousands of hectares, defended against a soil disease with no cure, and shipped across oceans in a condition that looks, to anyone who doesn't know better, like a mistake. And running alongside all of that, quietly, a second story about a part of the same plant that the entire industry spent most of its history treating as garbage, until enough people, in enough kitchens, on the other side of the world from these fields, decided it wasn't. Think back to the beginning of this video. A worker on a ladder, reaching into the leaves, cutting something free that most people watching had never once thought about. Multiply that single motion by every plant on every farm across an entire export industry, every single day, and you start to see the actual size of the opportunity that was sitting there the whole time. Not hidden, not rare, just unclaimed, for exactly as long as nobody on the fruit side of the business had a reason to look at it twice. If you've made it this far, you now know more about what's happening between the flower and the fruit on a banana plant than almost anyone who's ever eaten one. If stories like this, the parts of an industry hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice they were never actually waste, are what keep you watching, subscribe, because the next one is already out there, on some other farm, in some other supply chain, waiting to be looked at the same way.